Hello, and welcome everybody. There, that sounds better. I think people are still going to be trickling in, but I do think because of time we want to get started, and I want to first of all say hello and welcome to all of you. Really appreciate you being here. It's a pleasure to see some familiar faces and a lot of new faces, but we really urge you to keep an eye on upcoming events. And in that light, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Universal Design Council. We are a volunteer organization of people from all walks of life. We have professional, nonprofit. I myself am a realtor, but we all have a common interest in trying to promote and educate the idea that design doesn't need to be the way design's always been, that we need to be more intelligent about it and try to be more inclusive as far as being able to accommodate the greatest number of people to the greatest degree, regardless of how they are. We do have a meeting every month, the second Wednesday of each month, which is kind of a steering committee meeting, which is completely open and volunteer. We would love to have you participate, which kind of helps determine where we go with our quarterly meetings. The quarterly meetings then are really to promote, to get good information out. Like today, we have had a lot of talks from architects about universal design. We've had talks with builders and implementers of universal design. We've even had talks about universal design in digital communications. But this is the first time we've really had a talk about universal design in designing specifically for people with unique needs. So I'm really looking forward to having our guests today, and I'll introduce those in a minute. If you participate in no other way, I really encourage you to go out and look at our website at environmentsforall.com and or .org, excuse me, as well as our Facebook page, and the listserv is a great communications medium. We have a ton of people on that, but it's a good way to keep informed on that. Today, I would like to, first of all, introduce one of the three architects that we've had today, and that is my good friend Scott Starr, who is a principal at SMR Architects. Scott has been a longtime member of the Universal Design Council, but has been more active in the past. Scott and I actually have had an opportunity to speak together on a few occasions, but I won't embarrass Scott by talking about those. Scott and SMR Architects have also are known for winning the Pacific Coast Builders Conference Gold Nugget Award last month for their design of the Walkway Gardens. And the Seattle Housing Authority complex that supports multi-generational families, and it is adjacent to the Yesler Community Center. Just a housekeeping note too, I know there's probably going to be a lot of questions. What I would like you to do, if you could, is write your questions down and let's hold them. We'll have plenty of time for open discussion so that we can all get that out. And I also would like to say at the end of this meeting, one of the things that we really love to do at these quarterly meetings is give everybody an opportunity to meet each other and talk, because I think there's a lot of common interest in the room, and we found every meeting there's people who have made connections. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Scott Starr, and let me welcome him to the podium.
Let's see. Hello, can everyone hear me? Let's put this up here. Hey, well, thanks everyone for coming out today on a nice, warm, sunny day to hear about our challenges and opportunities for designing for the formerly homeless. Again, my name's Scott Starr. I work at SMR Architects, and we've have a long history of working for organizations that house the formerly homeless. I've worked on over 10 projects with the Downtown Emergency Service Center, which is an organization that is a housing first organization. And I've also worked with Compass Housing Alliance on a number of homeless shelters throughout the city. Let's see. Oh, wait a minute. I have control over this. Okay. So we all know that Seattle is facing a housing crisis, a crisis of homelessness. From the Seattle Times, you can see Seattle is the third in the U.S. for homeless population, behind New York City and Los Angeles. We have quite a few partial solutions to the issue of homelessness, and some of these work quite well. New permanent housing, of course, is a wonderful solution. Homeless shelters, rent support, and vouchers. Also, we've been looking at using tiny houses, small garden shed type structures in sort of organized communities run by organizations like the Low Income Housing Institute. And also there's a number of organizations that sponsor tent cities. Unfortunately, none of these have the full, the amount of resources, money, time, space to fully solve the problem. And it's still a political problem that we're working on in the city. But I'd like to talk about two of these partial solutions today and about the design challenges inherent in them. The first one is new permanent housing. There you can see an image of our 1811 East Lake building. It was the first new Housing First project in the nation for Downtown Emergency Service Center that we worked on. Housing First is a housing concept that was pioneered by the Downtown Emergency Service Center in Seattle, Skid Row Housing in Los Angeles, and Pathways to Housing in New York City. Housing First is a way that we can successfully house the formerly homeless. The first and most important principle of Housing First is to accept the formerly homeless as is. There are no criterias or barriers to housing. People do not have to be off of drugs. People do not have to have their mental health issues fully addressed in order to have housing in a Housing First building. The idea is that you take people in and then you stabilize people's mental and physical health after they're housed with clinical staff that are on site to work with the formerly homeless. Once people are stabilized in the housing, you help them transition away from life on the streets, which is a difficult struggle for someone who's been homeless. Homelessness is an incredibly traumatizing experience, and it's unbelievable how much it affects people. It's difficult to transition away from that life once you're in it, and it takes a long time. So once people are housed and they've been stabilized and transitioned away from homelessness, we work towards achieving long-term mental health goals and addiction recovery goals. And the last thing that's important to remember about Housing First is there's no time limit. All these things take time. Sometimes people recover and backslide and recover again. People can live in Housing First buildings permanently without having to worry about a time limit for recovery. So the first thing to look at is the transition from homelessness. And there's a lot of design and program features that help with this transition, even though it's very difficult and can be traumatic for people. First of all, the most important thing is 24-hour clinical staff on site. There needs to be office spaces, meeting rooms, and community rooms for the clinical staff to interact with and address the issues of the formerly homeless. Many projects, Housing First projects, have respite rooms to help people in crisis coming off the street. People who are coming off the street often need a space that's not a full dwelling unit. It doesn't have the appliances, doesn't have a full kitchen, is in a location where it can be closely monitored by clinical staff in case there's issues. People can live in these respite rooms for several weeks while they're transitioning from homelessness to living housed. One issue that the formerly homeless have is temperature regulation. And temperature controls in units have to be limited. Living on the streets and I don't know exactly the process involved, seems to do something to people's experience of temperature. You'll often see formerly homeless people in housing running the heater full blast on a hot summer day or opening windows in the middle of winter. I think that something about living out in the elements just messes with your ability to experience temperature for a while as you transition out of homelessness. People have difficulties with plumbing and water use, remembering to turn off faucets. You have to be careful to provide overflows in every plumbing fixture and floor drains in bathrooms. And finally, it's important to prevent the misuse of appliances like ovens. Amazingly, people who've experienced homelessness for a long time and have lived on the streets with mental health issues have a hard time readjusting to life, even to the point of readjusting to using simple appliances like ovens. We often put timers on ovens to limit their use. We link the range hoods to the ovens so that those are turned on automatically whenever ovens are turned on in Housing First projects. Outdoor spaces in Housing First buildings are very important. A lot of time people coming off the streets feel a little claustrophobic in units, and a lot of Housing First units are quite small. So it's very important to provide kind of a break from a small unit with an outdoor space. Obviously, a lot of these have to accommodate smoking. It's good to provide multiple small seating areas throughout the outdoor space and a small sheltered area for inclement weather. Finally, it's good to provide multiple access points to the outdoor space to prevent choke points where people can, run into each other and have conflicts. Oops. There. Accessibility is very important for Housing First projects. Poor health often, people who live on the street often have very poor health. That leads to reduced mobility. Also, the homeless population in Seattle is aging. The average age in a downtown emergency service center building is 50 years old. We've gone to installing grab bars in 100% of our Housing First units automatically. We have accessible sinks with clear knee space in 100% of our units. And we also include audio visual alarms in 25% of our units. A lot of people coming out of homelessness seem to have hearing and vision issues. Community spaces are very important to sort of draw people out of their shells and to build community in buildings. It's an important part of the clinical staff's interaction with the tenants, and it helps in their treatment of their mental health and addiction issues. Storage is a surprisingly important issue, which is surprising mainly because people have very few belongings when they come off the street. But those belongings are precious to them. Often they've been carted around physically from place to place for months or years. In our units, as you can see, we like to provide a lot of built-in storage opportunities, and it seems to be important to provide places where belongings can be stored in plain sight, where people can see them. So they don't get suspicious that someone has stolen their belongings, which happens a lot on the street. In these buildings, we never provide remote storage lockers. People don't trust a storage room down in the basement. And we also have to provide additional storage, temporary storage for belongings for people who are in transition. In our supportive housing projects, a lot of times people will have to go to the hospital to deal with a health issue for a few months. And sometimes people don't successfully make the transition. They just vanish from the supportive housing, go back to life on the streets, and then they'll return months or years later. So it's important to have a place to store what they have, if they leave and come back. Now I'd like to change topics a little bit to talk about homeless shelters, which have a whole different set of issues, unique design issues to them. The main thing is that homeless shelters are almost always adaptive reuse of existing buildings. They're often put in what I would call non-leasable places, basements, places out of the way or on busy streets, places that won't rent out and have low economic value that agencies that provide homeless shelters can afford to rent. There's severe budget constraints, and homeless shelters have an unbelievable volume of people moving through them. You know, an average homeless shelter, a small one, could have 300 to 400 people moving through it during a day, if it's a day shelter. There's also a lot of regulations that limit the hours of use, the type of activities that can go on in homeless shelters. They have a lot of restrictions. Usually the design features that you think about for homeless shelters all center around durability, because the massive number of people moving through and the numbers of people who have issues with mental health and drug addiction moving through them. You have to use very durable materials, as durable as possible. Usually this engineered attachments for counters, grab bar, and partitions is important. Normally, you know, when you attach a partition in a airport restroom, they probably just come with some hardware. You screw it into the floor and that's good. But for a bathroom partition in a homeless shelter, you have to get an engineer, design the backing, make sure it can take unbelievable loads. They take a lot of abuse. You have to maximize ventilation and drainage in these spaces. And it's great to have open spaces with lines of sight, but again, we're usually in a space that we haven't chosen because we're you know, limited to those non-leasable spaces. You also have to provide secure storage space and containers for belongings in these spaces. So I'd like to talk about code barriers for shelters, and it's kind of a surprising issue that's come up, and it's recently made it much more expensive to build homeless shelters in the city of Seattle, or really anywhere. It's not a zoning code issue. I'm not talking about NIMBYs or neighborhood opposition. What I'm talking about are sort of technical life safety building code changes that have made it more expensive to build shelters. Recently, they've changed the occupancy classification of shelters to a residential occupancy, which makes sense because people sleep overnight in them. But what happens is this typically triggers requirements for structural fire and life safety improvements, because we're often going into like a warehouse, which is a storage occupancy, and we're changing it to a residential use. The city of Seattle, when you change to a residential use, requires you to undergo what's called a substantial alteration, meaning you're going to make the building safe by providing seismic structural improvements, sprinklers, smoke detectors, all sorts of fire and life safety improvements to a building. You have to separate the sleeping areas from other areas in the building with 1-hour fire-rated partitions. Most existing spaces, even ones that you would think would be perfect for a homeless shelter, cannot be used as shelters without expensive modifications because of these rule changes. The image that you see on this slide is of the Spring Street shelter, which I worked on with Compass Housing Alliance. They moved into the basement of the First Plymouth Educational Wing up on First Hill. The space had a full commercial kitchen, a large open banquet hall. It was a concrete building. You would look at it, oh, it also had plenty of bathrooms. Looking at it, you would think you could move in, clean it up a little bit, and open it for almost no money. Everything was there to open a homeless shelter. I believe it took $800,000 worth of fire and life safety improvements to make this work. We had to bring in sprinklers. We had to put up layers of fire protective material around the sleeping areas. We had to, and we couldn't ever get the money to use the kitchen because we couldn't bring the kitchen up to current codes. So the kitchen's there, they just don't use it for the homeless shelter. So the city of Seattle does have a response to this. They understand that there's an issue in the expense for homeless shelters. And they've created what's called the Draft Director's Rule on April 2015 to partially address this. The rule tries to provide a certain level of safety without requiring as many of these expensive safety upgrades and structural upgrades. But you have to do certain things and follow certain rules to meet these requirements. The maximum number of people in the shelter under this draft rule is 50. There's limited hours of operation. People must leave every morning and can't come back until early in the evening, about 6 o'clock. Overnight, there has to be staff on hand to watch for fires and emergencies. No cooking is allowed. Smoke detectors are required, but they can be pretty inexpensive smoke detectors bought at Home Depot. No smoking, drug use, or drinking is allowed, and you have to notify the fire department that a homeless shelter is going in, the local fire station, which makes sense, so they can come take a look at it and understand that they need to quickly respond to any emergencies in that building. This program has worked well for shelters of this size. The image in this slide is of a Greenwood shelter for the Greenwood United Methodist Church. We put the homeless shelter in the educational wing of this church. It was a homeless shelter for women called the Hammond House, and it was done fairly inexpensively, only about $50,000 worth of modifications needed for it, compared to a larger shelter, which doesn't fit under this rule that might require, like I said, $800,000. Now, I'm not going to say that, I really understand where the building department's coming from and the fire department on this rule. I don't know what the proper trade-off is between providing housing and providing a safe, fireproof space for people. Homeless shelters are crowded, and there's definitely an issue with putting a bunch of people in a space that doesn't have fire sprinklers, doesn't have a proper fire alarm. So I'm not going to sit here and advocate for doing away with all those rules. But we all have to understand that with those rules comes a lot of expense in creating homeless shelters. And I think it's been one of the things that's slowed down the response to the homeless crisis in Seattle that hasn't gotten a lot of publicity. Again, I don't know what the proper trade-off is between the fire and life safety issues and providing housing for homeless people on the streets in these shelters. So I'll leave you with that to ponder. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. It's my pleasure to introduce Christine Cagney and Bill Singer to the podium. They are architects at Environmental Works, which is a nonprofit community design center. Environmental Works was founded to provide professional architectural and planning services to vulnerable people and underserved communities. The firm has specialized in designing senior housing, homes for independent community living, multifamily housing, community facilities, and child care centers. Bill is the Director of Architecture and the Housing Studio at Environmental Works. He was involved in designing the first LEED certified affordable housing project in the United States, right here in Seattle. For those of you that aren't familiar with the term of LEED, it stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's both a professional certification and a building certification issued by the U.S. Green Building Council. Christina is a project manager and operations manager at Environmental Works. She's a LEED certified or LEED accredited professional and a graduate of the Housing Development Consortium Leadership Cohort and the Pomegranate Center's Community Facilitation Training Program. So without further delay, I'd like to welcome Bill and Christina to the podium.
Good morning. And thank you to the Universal Design Council for inviting us this morning. We're really excited to show you our work here today. Just a little bit about Environmental Works. As Tom said, we were founded as a mission-based organization to serve underserved populations throughout the Northwest. We were founded on Earth Day of 1970, and we've been located at the historic Fire Station number 7 on Capitol Hill since 1971. All of our work is serving nonprofit community in the state of Washington. About 75% of our work is in the affordable housing realm, and the other 25% is serving what we call community facilities. That includes food banks, child care centers, community clinics, and other assorted community facilities. This is, how do I adjust the, I'm going to let, one of the foundations of our work is community design. I'm going to let Christina talk a little bit about that.
So a large part of our design process includes actually engaging the communities that we're building for in a community design process. So community design is when you ask the community, the stakeholders, the residents, what they would like to see in the building or in the space that we're designing for. Over half of our employees have been specifically trained in community design, and we try and cater the process specifically for our clients, and we kind of are trying to do some sort of community design in all the projects that we do, but different clients have different needs for community design. So our process is based on the Pomegranate Center's community design method, and if you guys don't know, the Pomegranate Center is sort of the experts in community design. They offer trainings a couple times a year. And so the process of community design involves a lot of different elements. It depends on what the client needs. It could be a sort of big picture brainstorming with the entire community. It could be sort of a visual preference survey where we put up a bunch of different images and the community tells us sort of what kind of images they like in terms of what they want the community to look like. We also do sort of like a kit of parts where we have different layouts for units, and people can move around different elements so they can tell us how they want their space to be, to look and feel. We have learned so much from doing this community design process. You know, we are just designers, and we can guess what different communities would like, but we're not ever going to know because different communities have really specific needs that we're not going to be able to tap into unless we ask. So some examples of things that we have learned through this community design process is, you know, different communities like to have closed kitchens. Different communities like to have a more open concept kitchen. Some communities like to have the living space overlooking playgrounds, where other communities like to have the kitchen overlooking the playground, depending on who's sort of watching the children. One example that I really like is we were designing an outdoor space for senior housing, and we were asking them what kind of what do they want to see in this outdoor community space? And I was thinking in my head, like, oh, maybe, you know, community garden or something. And they got really excited about having outdoor exercise space. So their idea was they had lots of, you know, their grandchildren would come over, or they actually were living with them. And when the children would be playing outside, they can be doing the exercise. And this was like a thing that everybody got so excited about. And that was something that we would never have known if we didn't ask. So that's kind of our sort of basis of how we approach the design process that we feel is really important when we're talking about designing for special populations.
So I'm going to talk about a few different, what we would consider special populations that we do work for. One would be seasonal farm worker housing. We do a lot of group homes for people with physical and disabilities, what we call special needs housing, permanent supportive housing, similar to what Scott was talking about earlier. Tiny house villages, we've been very involved with the development of those within the city of Seattle. We do a lot of tribal housing, and we've done a number of projects for people suffering from traumatic brain injury. This is an example of our seasonal farm worker housing that we did in Kashmir, Washington. This was done for the Washington Growers League, and I'm gonna go into some more detail about that later in the case studies section. This is an example of the special needs housing. We do a lot of work for an organization called Foundation for the Challenge, who remodel group homes for 4 to 5 residents with a resident manager, and we're typically taking a ranch house, doing accessibility upgrades, remodeling kitchens, bathrooms, adding ramps, widening doorways and halls. And we do about 4 or 5 of those a year. They range from Seattle to Tacoma to Spokane and other parts of the state. This is an example of the permanent supportive housing. This is a 45 unit building we did in Capitol Hill for Community House Mental Health Agency. This is the tiny house village in Ballard that we worked with Lehigh, Share, and the city of Seattle as one of the city-sponsored tiny house villages. This is an example of the tribal housing we've done. This was for the Puyallup tribe. It was 20 units of family housing, 1 and 2 bedroom units for families and elders in Northeast Tacoma for the Puyallup Nation. And this is a building that we did Terry Home in Auburn that's group home housing for people who suffered from traumatic brain injury. So now I'm going to go into case studies and do a kind of a little more in-depth discussion of each of these project types. The first project I was going to show you is Baqia Gardens. This is a project we did for Catholic Community Services. This is in downtown Seattle in Belltown. It's 2nd and Bell. It houses 2 programs, a Noel house, which the entire building is housing for homeless women. There's 2 programs in their Noel house, which serves 40 women in a more like a cubicle housing setting, and then Rose of Lima, which has 50 units of housing and more SRO models. It has a combined entry point on Bell Street where both programs enter at a secure entry point. There's a welcoming mail and library there where people can get greeted by receptionists. It's full-time staff, so people have to be buzzed in to enter the building. The second floor is the Noel House floor, which is the upper plan. It includes, there's 2 rooms of 4 20-bed cubicles. Each cubicle is approximately 6 by 8. It has built-in storage, and it has 5-foot-high walls, and then there's a common kitchen, eating dining space, and a little patio for resident use. And a lot of the meals are brought in by volunteer groups, as well as residents are allowed to use the kitchen to prepare their own meals. And then the 3rd through 6th floors are the Rose of Lima program, which is SRO units. Each person has their own room, which has a small kitchenette, a bath with a sink and toilet. There are shared bathing facilities, and then there's a shared living dining space on the 3rd floor, and kitchen and patio. One of the interesting things when we were designing this is because of Fair Housing Act rules and the requirement for the client to keep this a women's only program, we had to pull showers out of the apartment units for Rose of Lima. If they were fully self-contained units, then the HUD restriction would have forced them to allow men to stay in the building, which was not going to work for the program. This is a picture of the entry, the common entry point, showing the reception space, the ramp up from the sidewalk level from the inside, a little seating library space in the mail area adjacent to the reception. This is a photo of the Noel House common living dining space, the kitchen beyond. There was, in our discussions with the folks at Noel House, there was a desire for a variety of eating areas. So we have kind of the private or more private eating counter and the bay window looking out into the street, and then a series of kind of communal eating tables in the center of the room. And this is the outdoor common space. One of the things, as Scott was talking about with permanent supportive housing, security is a major issue. So even for outdoor space, we have 7-foot high security barriers around the perimeter. That's done with these glazed panels, so it still provides outlook to the surrounding neighborhood, but provides the security, the added security of having a higher barrier. This is a picture of the Noel House level. These are the cubicles. So we carefully designed these with the client and resident input to provide built-in storage. The height of them was carefully calculated to provide good staff oversight of the space, but also to provide privacy for the residents. And there's enough kind of built-in nooks and crannies in these spaces for people to personalize their individual cubicle. And again, these are just 6 feet wide by, or 6.5 feet wide by 8 feet long. And this is a picture of the typical studio apartment in the Rose of Lima program with a bed and little eating area. These are approximately 250 square foot spaces. And these are a couple of images of the exterior of the building looking from 2nd and Bell and along Bell Street, showing kind of the outdoor spaces there on the 2nd and 3rd floor. The next project I was going to show you was a tribal housing project we did in Nia Bay for the Macaw tribe. And this was one of the first. This is also permanent supportive housing. This is bringing formerly homeless tribal members back into the community. Substance abuse, mental health, all the issues that are common to homelessness here are even more compounded up in tribal country. So they're dealing, so this is one of the first projects, as I say, in the Northwest to help address those specific issues with housing for tribal members. And one of the pieces of this was we spent a lot of time working with the tribe and through workshop methods to develop this plan that was culturally responsive. The plan here you're seeing is designed around a courtyard, and one of the interesting things of the Macaw tribe, they have this amazing museum up in Nia Bay, if people have ever been up there, that has a lot of historic information about their traditional living patterns. So we designed the space to kind of reflect their traditional Macaw fishing village around a courtyard. It's a very harsh climate up there in Nia Bay. They get almost 120 inches of rain a year, so protection from the elements is an important feature. And so the housing, which is shown in blue, wraps around the courtyard, and the building at the south end is the Commons building. And then the center courtyard is all designed around the center circle, which is an important feature in the Native culture. As I said, we went through, this project involved a number of workshops with tribal members to develop kind of ideas for housing units, common outdoor space, and kind of also the whole visual imagery of the building, and to make sure we're reflecting the culture of the Makah people. This is a picture of the front of the building. The center cedar-clad structure is what we call the Longhouse Commons. That's the central entry point for the building. And then the gray section, shed roof section, are the housing, 2 stories of housing that wrap around the commons. This is just a photo of the common meeting room in the longhouse space. The longhouse is again modeled after the traditional Makah. Longhouse is a big open room with open beam ceilings. The center entry spot has a reception area and a glazed circular fireplace to create, again, the warmth and welcoming features that the Makah were looking for. This is a typical interior of a unit. Again, this was designed with the input from the residents about open dining kitchen concepts. Photo again of the hearth, the fireplace, which is kind of fundamental to the features of the Makah people. The next project I was going to show you is Brender Creek. This is a seasonal farm worker project we did in Kashmir. It was completed in 2015 for the Washington Growers League. It's sandwiched between the Wenatchee River to the north and Brender Creek to the south. You can see it's a cluster of 6 buildings around common outdoor spaces. It provides 200 beds of housing for seasonal farm workers in groups of bunk rooms of 4 people each. Here's the typical plan. These are two-level units, so there's one of these stacked on top of each other. So there's 4 bedrooms with 4 people in each. They're in bunk beds. And then they are designed around a central living space, central living dining space. And then the bathroom spaces are compartmentalized to try and toilets, showers, sinks are all in separate areas to try and allow maximum flexibility for usage. And then another central feature to this, because of the harsh, hot climate they're dealing with in central Washington, is having the covered porch and shade. And the farm workers are typically working from about 5 a.m. till 1:30, and they come back really at the heat of the day. And so they need that covered space. They like to be outside, but they need some protection from the sun, so the covered deck was an important feature. This is a view of one of the units with the covered porch entry. The design is to reflect kind of the rural farm character of the surrounding community. This is some photos of the common outdoor space. The building in the center is where common laundry facilities, and then there's a large, again, shaded common outdoor patio for larger gatherings. View from one of the porches looking down to the common building. This is an interior of the common living dining space. Each resident, because of the temporary nature, is given a secure storage for their foods and staples, and then you can see the kitchen beyond that opens up to that. Kitchens are designed for maximum durability and for flexible, multiple people to use. The sinks are stainless steel. We have multiple cooktops, so allow 4 to 6 to 8 people working there at a time. And this is a typical picture of the bedrooms. As Scott was talking about, durability is a huge issue for this kind of housing. The floors are all just stained concrete, lots of durable finishes, the steel bunk beds, cubbies for storage for the residents. So the seasonal farm workers are typically here for a week to 2 weeks while they're picking, and then another group will come in. So there, a lot of the residents here are H-2A workers coming up from Mexico with temporary worker permits as they work from various growers' spaces throughout the Northwest. Next project I was going to show you was one of our tiny house village projects. This was one of the first ones we worked at 22nd and Union. This project was sponsored by the church, Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd, who are located right on Union Street. This was a vacant residential lot adjacent to the church property. And this was when the church agreed to sponsor this. They wanted to make sure it was all tiny houses. They didn't want a tent encampment. So we worked with the Low Income Housing Institute, Nicholsville, and the church to develop these tiny houses. There are 16 on this lot. They are designed to meet the City of Seattle requirements to be below the threshold of requiring a building permit, which is meaning they have to be under 120 square feet. That includes the roof overhang. So the module for the tiny houses is 8 by 12. They're 96 square feet. And one of the other neat things that we got to do with this project is develop a tiny house handbook, because most of these projects are built by volunteer groups, whether churches, businesses, a lot of apprenticeship programs. So we worked with the Wood Technology Center to develop this tiny house handbook that includes a complete list of materials that somebody can take to Home Depot and get the complete material list group, which is about $2,500 of materials. And then it's a step-by-step process to build the tiny houses. It's done similarly to like an IKEA instruction manual. And the idea was really that a church group, a volunteer group with the materials on site could put this together with 6 to 8 people in a weekend. And it's, and then the size is such that then they can be transported to the tiny house villages, because most of the city sponsored ones are given a 2-year limitation, so these need to be transportable. And this is the tiny house village at 22nd and Union right after it opened. It's subsequently now been in operation for a couple of years, and people have really taken over this common outdoor space. They're gardening. It's really become quite a lively commons area. And one of the interesting things is our handbook has been used and modified by various groups, and so it's kind of a template to be used, but it's really worked effectively. I think we've been told over 300 groups have used the handbook to build tiny houses, so that's really neat. And then the last project I'm going to talk about is a veterans housing project we recently completed, again for Catholic Community Services. This is in Olympia. It's the Drexel House Veterans Housing, and this completes a campus plan that CCS started in early 2000. There was, sorry, I'm not sure what's going on, but the buildings to the left were existing, and they included 25 units of permanent supportive housing and a transitional housing structure, as well as on-site support spaces. So our program is the building you see on the right, which is 50 units of permanent supportive housing, and these are all studio units, and it kind of completes the campus, if you will. And there was an existing detention pond from the first phase that was kind of a major site feature, if you will, as we were designing the space, and we really tried to use that as a enhancement of developing this new campus. So our building, the phase 2 building is an L-shaped building. All the units are more or less the same. They are studio apartments. There's 5 fully accessible Type A units. Most of the common areas for the campus are in the other transitional housing buildings, so we just have some on-site office case manager space and a small meeting room. the residents from this building go across the way for some program features at the other building. So a lot of what we did, again, this project had a strong basis in the workshop program. Because we had residents from the existing building, we could really engage them into the design of the new space, and we got a lot of great feedback on what was working on the first phase from the other project. We were not the architects of the first project, so they were very free and open to telling us what was working and not working, and then we could use that in the design of their new apartments, as well as we got a lot of feedback from the residents and the staff about how to design the common areas, and that really helped shape how the campus got developed. We ended, what was originally, we thought, an eyesore, the detention pond, we ended up kind of creating as a focal point for the site. We created this new bridge with a gravel path that wraps around the detention pond, and then replanted the pond with a new gravel pathway, and it's really created this nice kind of exercise dog walk path. A lot of the residents have service animals, so it gives them a secure place on site to walk their pets, as well as it gives easy access now to the other buildings on the other side of the pond. One of the other aspects of this was respecting and giving homage to the veterans, who are most of the residents of that. So we provided flags for the five of the armed services as you're entering the site. And there's an entry portal there for pedestrians from the site that also kind of pays homage to the veterans with some plaques. This is a picture of the interior of the site. One of the feedbacks we got in our workshops was really enhanced connections to outdoors. The apartments from the other project didn't have many windows, and the windows they had minimal operable panels, so they wanted maximum natural light, lots of ventilation. We added also the ceiling fans there as a kind of outgrowth of the workshops and input from the residents. So these units tend to have very good airflow and natural ventilation. This is a view looking back towards the small kitchen. This is one of the features was the new covered patio. A lot of the residents wanted this patio space where they could look out over the common areas, be outside but be covered and protected. So that's the genesis of this covered patio. This is some pictures of the perimeter walkway. It includes gardening spaces for residents, and you can see this is these were taken a year after at our 1-year walkthrough, and residents are actually using the garden plots, which was really neat to see. Some of the other features of the perimeter path, we created seating nooks and other enhancements for around the perimeter path, and it's really been working the way they anticipated, which is really neat. Now I'm going to let Christina talk about Prevail Project.
So Prevail is an organization that does programs and services for people with disabilities. This project is a 12-bed boarding home for people with traumatic brain injury. Which button do I? Okay. This is the site, and it's a really great site for this purpose. I just wanted to show you, it's on 175th in Shoreline. It's close to a lot of amenities to help for the people with traumatic brain injury who are going to be a little bit more independent living, so they can go to Safeway, they can go to Walgreens in a sort of close vicinity, walkable vicinity. The site is oddly shaped. It was kind of a good thing and a bad thing, but we ended up sitting the building back a little ways, and I think it was good, especially for this population, to give a little bit more privacy and quiet. There's a really heavily treed area on the east side that really creates a really nice patio space. There's 3 different patios, the entry porch, a bigger kind of community barbecue area, and then another smaller porch with some community gardens. At the beginning of the design process, we gave a couple of examples to Prevail, and we were trying to maximize the circulation and make it really efficient, and they came back to us and they were like, we do not want this to feel institutional at all. That was their feedback from our options that we gave them. And so they like some of the elements that we provided in our options, but one of the things they said was they don't like the really long corridors that we were thinking we were going to be providing. They wanted they wanted to limit the line of sight, which I think is different than what we think of often. I think to sort of limit this, the stimulation a little bit, and to not make it feel so institutional. They kept saying over and over again, do not make this feel institutional. So this is the plan that we came up with. It's kind of an oddly shaped plan, but what they wanted to do was create kind of two different pods, all with 6 units in them, or rooms. They both have there's a bathroom and a restroom. There's a library and kind of an activity room adjacent to them all. One of the things that they wanted to do with this is really create lots of different areas and different sized areas for people. So people with traumatic brain injury have different needs, and you can't really predict what those needs are going to be. So we provided, the entryway and the living, dining, kitchen area is sort of the big open common area. So it's sort of the social space. They have big events there. And then there's an activity room that's it's social, but it's sort of a secondary level of being social. And then there's a therapy space. And then the smaller libraries are meant to be, if you wanted quiet, you could go to the libraries. You don't have to be in your room. You could go and hang out in the library in a kind of quieter space. And one of the things that we did with Prevail was create a vision board for them. We provided images that we had from other projects, and some of the words that came up were, open, home-like was like a huge one. They wanted to feel like a home. They wanted outdoor space. They wanted it to be comfortable. They wanted sort of a pronounced entry with a porch, and they wanted some intimate spaces, limiting the line of sight, and really durable. The thing that we did, we created this vision board and we kind of brought it to all of our meetings. So it kind of helped focus what our goals were from the very beginning. And we never really strayed from that, I feel. Prevail was really great. They're really great clients, and they knew what they wanted, and they wanted to really make sure that we met our goals. So that was really nice to work with them. So this is the view from the front entry. We had the entry porch like in our vision, and tried to make it kind of feel home and comfortable. The doors are 4-foot wide entry doors for accessibility. And this is a view from the living room looking out into the kitchen and the dining space, and with the kind of comfortable fireplace. And then the kitchen and the dining room, you can see that there's a lot of space, to help people moving through the space. If there's multiple people in wheelchairs, you want to be able people to move freely without feeling sort of on top of each other. And we have a nice big kitchen, so multiple people can work in the kitchen at once. This is the room from the activity room, the game room. You can see that there's another 4-foot wide door, and this is sort of meant to be like a secondary social room where you can still see through into the bigger dining space. So if you wanted to have a little bit more privacy, but more quiet, you can do that, but still feel connected to what's going on in the living room. Lots of storage throughout. This is the therapy room with a view into the library. So a lot of these spaces have dimmable light fixtures. So depending on the needs of the people with traumatic brain injury, they can make the lights bright or dim depending on what's happening. And you can see back in the back corner there where the green is, that's a unit or a room entry. And we kind of created these little alcoves into the rooms to kind of pronounce those rooms as kind of like the room's little front entry area, and they can personalize those little alcoves and make it kind of their own entry space. I think it's kind of weird. I showed you a hallway. This is not super exciting, but for this project it kind of is, because you can see that this is a really small hallway, and this was like intentional, that we're trying to create these small kind of community areas, or small areas that were, so it's not this one big long hallway, I guess. Back in the back is the bathroom, and you can see that there's a little button, and one of the details that they wanted was this accessible button to not be the traditional stagnant person in a wheelchair. It's this active moving person. And I thought that kind of shows you how Prevail was really looking at those little details and trying to make this feel like a home and like people belonged here. This is a view from the bathrooms, and it's fully accessible with tile floor and grab bars throughout and everything. And we tried to really select the colors and the finishes to make it feel comfortable and like a home. So I look at this and I think I would love to have this bathroom in my house, right? So at least I would. Just to try and make it feel comfortable and not institutional was kind of the goal, and make it beautiful. This is a view from a bedroom, and there's different bedrooms that have different amounts of windows depending on the needs of the person. So you could pick a bedroom that has lots of light or not very much at all. A little detail that Prevail wanted was bronze door hardware, and I think that just kind of another little detail that makes it feel a little bit more warmth. And that's it. Bill is going to talk about some projects that we have on the boards.
So just a few projects that are in the works. A couple are in design and some are in construction. This project, we just broke ground on it. It's a 23rd in Union. It's for Community House Mental Health Agency, and this is going to provide housing provide 53 units of permanent supportive housing for people coming out of homelessness and suffering from lifelong chronic mental illness. It's also going to house the administrative offices for Community House and a day center for their residents and outside clients where they can provide meals program, case management, medical services. And adjacent to that is going to also be 74 units of workforce housing serving families making up to 60% of median income. It'll include studios, 1 and 2 bedroom units, and it will also have ground floor retail. For Environmental Works, it's a really big project. It's by far the biggest project we've ever done, so it's really exciting for us to see this starting. This project is in Everett. It's for Catholic Community Services. It's permanent supportive housing for homeless residents. Everett and Snohomish County are having a huge homelessness problem. A lot of it revolved around opioid addiction. So this project has strong support from the city of Everett as part of their Safe Streets program. So it will have 65 units of permanent supportive housing, on-site case management. And one of the really things that we're excited about too is this project received pilot funds from the state's ultra-high energy efficiency program that the State Housing Trust Fund introduced last year to achieve net zero energy use. So the large solar panel roof that you see will provide enough electricity power to run the entire building. So it's one we're really excited about. There's a lot of envelope upgrades and mechanical systems here that we use for the first time to achieve that energy efficiency. This is a project that's still in early design in Kirkland. It's a 96-bed shelter for families and women at the location of Salt House Church in Kirkland, adjacent across the street from Lake Washington High School and the cemetery. It's being sponsored by, again, Catholic Community Services and Sophia Way, who will run the women's shelter. It's 2 separate programs on separate floors. So the women's shelter will house 84 women in cubicles, similar to the Noel House project I showed you earlier. And then the first floor is going to be for families, and they'll have 48 beds in 12 different rooms for families of up to 4 each. And each of those will also have a day center, so that to serve the residents and also outside homeless folks to come and use their programs during the day. And that's scheduled hopefully to break ground a year from, or spring of 2019 for completion in early 2020. And then the last project is another seasonal farm worker project we're doing in Mattawa, Washington. This is also for the Washington Growers League, our same client from Kashmir. And this project will be, when it's fully built out, we'll have 500 beds of farm worker housing. The first phase was completed this spring, showing you kind of, it's a series of 48-bed buildings, 2 stories each, modeled similar to the project I showed you at Brender Creek, and there will be 12 of these buildings when the project's fully built out. As I said, housing up to 500 seasonal workers. And that's our work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill and Christina. Now, I know some of you have got questions, and great opportunity to address them to the speakers here. What I would like you to do, if you have questions, is to raise your hand, and we'll run a microphone to you for the benefit of everybody that's here today, so we can hear. And also, when the question is addressed to one of you, if you could just come up here and speak into the microphone, that'd be great. But do stand up. We want to see who you are. Does anybody have any questions? Go ahead.
When you stand up?
Yeah, please. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Hey, have any of you worked on any projects or efforts to combine housing for vulnerable populations, homeless, people with disabilities, into non-specialized housing projects that would be every Joe on the street going trying to find housing? I mean, integrating not just specialized populations who have special needs with just standard housing. Have there been any efforts that you guys have worked on or heard of?
Anybody?
You know, I'm not aware of that, to tell you the truth. The problem, especially with the permanent supportive housing, case management and support services that are needed for that population makes it difficult to kind of mix that with folks who are not suffering from the same issues as them. Sometimes the project that I showed you at 23rd and Jackson, we just started construction, will have more standard affordable housing units with the permanent supportive housing, but they will be, for all intents and purposes, separate buildings, separate entries, so the programs don't really intermix. It's from a case management and property management standpoint, it's pretty difficult to do. I don't know if you have any input on that.
No, I'd agree with Bill that it's difficult to combine supportive housing specifically with any other type of housing. Just because of the nature of people's experience coming out of homelessness, like for instance, the front desk staff want to control who comes in and out of the building and to monitor visitors, to make sure that they don't have any sort of bad outside influences coming into the building. So, and usually in supportive housing projects, there's a certain critical mass you need to make it economical for an agency to run, about 70 to 80 units minimum for the supportive services to sort of be economical with that. So it's hard to combine with a typical housing.
Anybody else? Who's back here?
Hi, is this on? Yeah, I actually had two questions. One is a follow-up to his. Like, how do you deal with when, special populations within special populations? I know you were talking about supportive housing, but like, for example, that women's shelter for the cubicles, obviously those were inaccessible. So what happens if a woman comes in a wheelchair with mobility issues, et cetera? Is there a pathway for her? That was kind of the first question. The second one is, regarding funding, are these projects that kind of mission focused? Are they do they run into the same funding challenges as normal projects where you have to go through value engineering and all of that? Or I'm just curious about the funding challenges of getting these beautiful projects completed.
For the For the Noel House project with the cubicles, we did have, I believe, about half dozen that were sized for people in wheelchairs. So we did, and then the common facilities, the restrooms, the common bathrooms are all fully accessible. So there was accommodation for people in wheelchairs there. Sorry, the second part of your question. Yeah, these projects are, these are all publicly funded projects, and there are pretty strict parameters on the cost per square foot, cost per unit. So we're under tight restrictions, but there's also an understanding that, at least for permanent supportive housing, the durability issues, it just requires a higher cost per square foot for the construction. So there is that understanding that these are going to be a little more expensive than a standard housing unit. But these are all, what Scott was showing, the projects we do are all being built with public funds. So we're under strict, value engineering. We do have to go through that value engineering exercise pretty typically, yeah.
But you get paid for your time?
Yes, we are a fee-for-service group, so we have a architect contract with the owner to design their building. Yeah.
So what you just said reminded me of something that I wrote down during one of the earlier presentations, and that's the difference between the client and the customer, which I'm sure comes up a lot in the work that you're doing. I know in a project that I'm deeply involved in, the client originally was housing provider, but the customers were what I would call free-range elderly people, people living in the community wherever they were living. And so when you have the client trying to think on behalf of the customer, you already got a problem. So some of the design, some of the stuff you were talking about, design process where it's really the customers that you need to be hearing, and hopefully the client's just as interested in hearing from them as you are, but I imagine that's sometimes a challenge. And it comes up, with hearing issues, for example.
Anyone else?
And I have 2 questions. My first question had to deal with the participatory process, how you were able to engage members of the homeless community in designing their own space. What did you use, charrettes, or how did you detail that process, if you could? And then the other component question I have has to do with net zero. You mentioned the solar array, but I was curious about building technology. Are we looking at R60 all throughout? Did you use prefabricated forms? I was hoping that you could go in a little more detail about that aspect as well.
Related to your first question about engaging the homeless population, it is a problem. It's difficult sometimes. One of the opportunities we had with the Homeless Veterans Project we did in Olympia was that we had these residents from across the way in their existing facilities. So that gave us a built-in resident pool to work with, so that was really helpful. That's not always the case a lot of times, but many times our clients, the nonprofits, they have access to folks, and it's bringing them into the conversation. These workshops is obviously critical to making that all work. So we've had some success with actually bringing in the homeless resident population. It isn't always the case. And related to the net zero project, besides the solar array, there are a lot of kind of advanced technologies we're doing in the buildings. The roof, the entire building envelope is quite robust, significantly over code. I don't know if you're familiar with passive house standards. It's getting very close to passive house standards. We have a fluid applied air barrier to reduce air leakage. The wall insulation is about R40. The roof is R60. We have a fully insulated slab. We are doing some for the hot water system. We're doing an air-to-air air-to-air heat pump system. The unit ventilation is done with a heat recovery ventilation system. So there's a lot of new technologies we're doing here to achieve that net zero. It's a challenge, and one of the interesting things of the program is they also requiring us to do some fairly significant digital controls and monitoring. So the state, to receive the funding, is requiring 3 years of data to show that we're meeting the net zero criteria. So it'll be interesting to see as the project develops and during occupancy how it all pans out. Thank you.
Anyone else?
With the urgent need for housing in our area, you've talked about rather traditional construction and traditional everything, and I realize there's local requirements that must be met. But Compass Housing is building in Edmonds with blockable, which they claim will be much more rapid. Are any of you looking at non-traditional methods of construction so that we could have more rapid housing?
You want to take a step?
Let's see, we're actually working with Compass Housing on that project in Edmonds, and the Blockable is a company that makes kind of modular steel-framed housing that can be kind of assembled from individual blocks into larger buildings. And they are, we're working on it. It's showing some promise. The issue is going to be actually doing the first project that has a larger sized number of units done quickly and affordably. Right now, it's still kind of a pilot project, and we're sort of, it's a test to see if this can work for affordable housing. I do think it has some promise. So what they've installed right now in Edmonds is a single sort of studio unit that was built remotely and kind of brought in and craned onto the site. And it'll be a space for one person to live on this site at Edmonds Lutheran Church. But they're looking at, in the future, doing about 45 of these on an adjacent property, built down in Vancouver, Washington, brought up and assembled into a series of larger buildings that'll provide 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units for people, for families on this site. It's exciting, but it's still pretty experimental. And we'll see if they're able to control costs and get it done quickly and efficiently. Right now, I know that they're looking for funding for the project, so we'll keep our fingers crossed and hope that it goes forward soon.
Does anyone else have a question for the speakers? Okay. If not, I want to thank all of you today for coming. I do really encourage you, a couple of things. One is second Wednesday of every month, like I mentioned, we have our steering committee meetings. We really encourage you to join in on us and participate. If you'd like any more information on that, you can ask Jonathan Winters in the back, and I'd be glad to provide that. Also, look for our upcoming quarterly meeting. As part of our quarterly meetings, like I said, I would really encourage you to circulate amongst the guests today and introduce yourself and find out. I think we all have information to share. And again, I want to thank you all very much for coming today. Give you all good applause here.